Welcome to a new segment of Coptic civilization. I'm Michael Saad. Our topic today is on Nubian Christianity and its connection with the Coptic Church and Coptic Christianity in general. Our guest is Dr. Salim Faraji, Associate Professor and past Chair of Africana Studies at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Welcome, Professor.
Welcome. Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be here to share this time with you to talk about the relationship between Coptic Christianity and the Nubian Church.
It's my honor to be your host, and thank you for accepting our invitation to be a guest on Coptic Civilization program.
Yes.
You produced this fabulous book, The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh. What an stimulating title. I'm so excited about it, and I read much of it. It's quite long. It's over 325 pages.
Yes.
And in the back index, a lot of Coptic names, Coptic saints, Coptic monuments, and Coptic monasteries. And so I became so curious about reading your book. Thank you for writing it. I understand it is part of your PhD dissertation.
Yes, yes.
And what is the premise of your book in uncovering the roots of Nubian Christianity?
Nubian Christianity is one of the four early African Christian traditions. Of course, we have the North African Church, which survived up until the coming of Islam. Then we have, of course, Coptic Christianity, the Coptic Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and probably the lesser-known Christian tradition in Africa, in antiquity, Northern Africa, is Nubian Christianity, the Nubian Church. So I decided to put forth a book that dealt with the history of Nubian Christianity, more specifically the roots of Nubian Christianity, the origins of Nubian Christianity. And of course, in order to talk about the roots of Nubian Christianity, we have to talk about the Coptic Church and Coptic civilization. Of course, when we say Nubia in antiquity, we're referring roughly between Aswan and southern Egypt, all the way to Khartoum in northern and central Sudan. This region of the Nile Valley was called Nubia in antiquity. At other times, it was also referred to as Kush. And when most people think of Nubia, or should I say the Sudan today, they think, of course, of a culture in a country that is predominantly Islamic. And that is certainly the case, but up until the 15th century, Nubia, which its heart was in the Sudan, was also a Christian civilization for nearly 1,000 years, from the 5th century to nearly the 15th century AD. The Sudan, or the ancient kingdoms of Nubia, were a Christian civilization. So my book deals with that history. And of course, I deal with the relationship between the Nubian Church and, of course, the Coptic Church. If anyone were to Google or do an internet search on Nubian Christianity, they would tell you that Nubian Christianity began in the 6th century. as a result of the Byzantine missions of Emperor Justinian, who was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire at Constantinople at the time. And of course, the empress, his wife and queen, Theodora, sent 2 Coptic monks to Nubia, first Julian, and then subsequently Longinus, and Nubia was converted to Christianity 543 CE or AD in the north, the Nubian kingdom, 569 CE in Mercuria, the Mercurian kingdom, and then the kingdom of Awa in the far south, 580 AD. This is the traditional history for the beginning of Christianity in ancient Nubia. But in my book, I demonstrate very clearly that Christianity had been in Nubia well before Justinian, well before the Byzantine missions, at least 200 years prior. And really, you have to look at the relationship between northern Sudan and the Coptic Church and Coptic monasticism and Coptic merchants in the 3rd and 4th century. This is really when Nubian Christianity begins. So this is the premise of my book, that it does not begin with the Byzantine missions. It actually begins with a king by the name of King Silko, who was a pharaoh in Nubia, and his court's relationship with Coptic monks and Coptic merchants in the 5th century.
You made me curious about when you mentioned this king. Was that the pharaoh that you are referring to here as the triumph of the last pharaoh in the subtitle of the book, or these are 2 different personalities?
Yes, absolutely. The subtitle of my book is The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh. And many people ask, as we're posing here today, who was the last pharaoh? And of course, his name was King Silko. It's not that he was the last pharaoh or ruling king in pharaonic civilization in the Nile Valley, but he definitely was the last to make the transition from classical pharaonic culture in ancient Nubia to Christianity. And his name was King Silko. So I rightly titled the book The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh, to highlight this very little known Nubian pharaoh in late antique Nile Valley history. His name was King Silko. What's fascinating is that he left an inscription in Greek, and scholars now know that this Greek inscription had Copticizing influence. So many of the Greek words in this particular inscription, we could see through morphology that there was Coptic influence. In other words, the person who actually wrote this inscription in Greek, scholars believe pretty much was a Coptic monk or priest working on behalf of the Nubian court in the 5th century. And he left an inscription in Greek, and in the inscription, in a nutshell, he says that God gave me the victory over surrounding Nubian kingdoms. This was important because scholars believe that the Nubians continued to be quote-unquote pagans at that time, and they did not think that Christianity had actually begun to emerge in the early 5th century. But he says, God gave me the victory. So again, scholars and historians want to attribute the founding of Christianity in ancient Nubia to Byzantine missions, to Justinian, to Empress Theodora, and in actuality, it actually begins with this Nubian pharaoh, King Silko, in the 5th century, when he leaves his inscription on the temple of Kalapsha in southern Egypt, just outside of Aswan, where he declares, I have gained victory because God gave me the victory. So this is why the book is subtitled The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh, the roots of Nubian Christianity uncovered, the triumph of the last pharaoh.
As you may expect, what you are talking about is music to my Coptic ear.
Yes.
And I'm so delighted for being a Copt to hear that such connection existed between the Coptic Church and the Coptic Christianity in general and Nubian Christianity.
Yes.
You referred to this a couple of times while you are talking, and now you are contrasting with the common knowledge that the Byzantine were the starters.
Yes.
But now you are arguing against that premise
Yes.
and putting forward the Coptic influence.
Yes.
Would you kindly elaborate on the significance of the Coptic Church on the roots of Nubian Christianity?
Well, when we look at Nubia, we have to look at the border between what is now Sudan. Well, not the modern contemporary border, but what the border was in antiquity, which was right where Aswan and Elephantine sits.
So Aswan was part of the Nubian kingdom of the north.
Yes, it was the northern. Aswan was the northernmost frontier of the Nubian kingdom.
Okay.
But it was also a city that also was in Egypt proper.
Right.
So it was a liminal city, if you will, sharing two regions, both Egypt and Nubia.
Yeah.
And it is there where we find the earliest churches being built in what is now the Temple of Philae in Aswan.
Right.
At the Temple of Philae, the establishment of St. Stephen's Church there. But even prior to that, we see that there are Nubians who have been visiting Aswan and the Temple of Philae for centuries. And it is at that point that they come into contact with the earliest Coptic monks and Coptic priests as early as the early 4th century. So scholars are aware of this because it's written in Coptic sources, but historians want to downplay the influence. They say, well, just because a church was being built at the Temple of Philae, just because Abba Macedonius and his two sons had established a church there, doesn't necessarily mean that they had direct influence on the founding of Nubian Christianity. But when we read certain Coptic sources and Coptic stories and the Coptic hagiography and so forth, we see that they mention Nubians quite frequently. And so we have to begin, again, with the Coptic influence in southern Egypt on the border of Nubia to really get at the founding of Nubian Christianity.
Yeah.
So I begin the conversion process first with Coptic influence, number one. Second, with the monumental victory of this Nubian pharaoh and his relationship with Coptic merchants as well as Coptic monasteries. And then the Byzantine missions come is the third and final stage, actually not the first stage.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned the sources that you unearthed and really critically studied them and presented a new theory based on these sources.
Yes.
What are these sources and where did you find them?
Well, these, some of the sources are in Coptic, some are in Greek, as well as in Arabic. One of the sources that I deal with in my book is often known as the Histories of the Monks of Upper Egypt. Sometimes it's also called the Life of Aaron because it was actually written about by the monk Aaron. And in this particular Coptic source, Nubians are mentioned 4 times, and the Coptic source may be attributed to the 5th century. But we believe the events that the story describes actually take place in the early to mid 4th century. And in this source, Nubians are mentioned at least 4 times in this history of the monks of Upper Egypt.
Yeah.
And I discuss these examples. There's one example in particular where a Nubian man has his son near the Nile River, and he's swimming in the river, maybe bathing and so forth, and a crocodile comes and grabs him in this story, and then one of the Coptic monks goes to the Nile River, calls the crocodile, and then retrieves the man's son.
The crocodile obeys the Coptic monk.
The crocodile obeys.
The boy is saved.
And the boy is saved.
Wow.
The Nubian then is impressed by this.
Yes.
And then he returns to his town and his village, and the fame of the Coptic monks spread.
Yes.
This is one story that's in the history of the monks of Upper Egypt.
Yes.
There's also a story of healing healing a camel, a Coptic monk healing the camel of a Nubian herdsman, and so forth. And then there's another instance where Coptic monks say that they saw Nubians in the desert during their prayer time and their vigils and so forth. So this source describing events of the early 4th century, in the fact that it mentions, it's a Coptic source.
In the Coptic language.
In Coptic language.
Yes.
And it mentions Nubians at least 4 times.
Was that source translated to English?
Yes, it has been translated into English.
Under what title? If I go to Amazon and try to find it.
It's under the title, The History of the Monks of Upper Egypt.
Yes.
There's one scholar more recently, Jitsa Daitra, who has argued that it shouldn't be called that it should be called The Life of Aaron, because it's actually about Abba Aaron. But
Abba Aaron was a Copt?
A Copt monk, yes.
Yeah. Wow.
But the traditional naming of the...
And your fabulous book includes reference to all of these sources.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
This is a book that every Copt should read, really.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because 2 things come to my, as a layman myself, not a scholar like you are and specialized in this field. I have 2 names, Saint Moses, we call him Saint Moses the Strong.
Yes.
And he is mentioned here.
Yes, he is.
And recently his personality has become quite popular.
Yes.
We have a church in his name in St. Anthony's Monastery here in California.
Yes.
And we have a whole monastery in Texas, a Coptic monastery by the name of St. Mary and St. Moses the Strong Abbey.
Yes.
And so he's becoming a popular saint. Many Coptic churches all of a sudden are named after St. Moses. So was he Nubian or Ethiopian or otherwise?
Well, St. Moses was a Nubian.
Okay.
He's often called St. Moses the Ethiopian, or St. Moses the Black in the literature. Of course, Ethiopian was a generic term in the Greek language for anyone who had dark skin. Okay. So, I mean, even people in India were called Ethiopians in classical literature, simply because they had dark skin. But if we look at where he was from one of the Nubian kingdoms. Okay. So he could have been a Nubian, another kingdom called the Blemmyes, which was another Nubian kingdom. So St. Moses was indeed a Nubian, and his story, and I mention his story in my book, I reference his story alone demonstrates the relationship between Nubians and the Coptic Church, and the influence that the Coptic Church had on his life, because he was said to have been a marauder and a bandit and a gangster, and then his life was transformed and he became a part of the monastery and became heralded as one of the great monks. So yes, his story is a testament of the relationship between Nubia and the Coptic Church.
Yeah. The Arabs invaded Egypt in the 7th century, and they tried to invade Nubia for many centuries, but they failed until like 900 years later or something like that. Or would you please elaborate on this? How long did Nubian Christianity last, and what is the timeline and the factors that enabled the Arab eventually to invade Nubia and convert it to Islam?
Well, of course, the Arabs come into Egypt between 639 and 652. At that time, they also moved southward and attempt to conquer Nubia. By that time, Nubia has been divided into 3 kingdoms: Nobadia, Mercuria, and Awa. These 3 kingdoms, the central capital being at Old Dongola, which is in the heart of the Sudan today. So the Arabs attempt to conquer Nubia. They attempt to conquer them, and they're unsuccessful. They basically fight to a stalemate. And what's fascinating about this is that the Arabs are impressed and mesmerized by the Nubian archers. Nubia had a reputation for thousands of years for having very good archers. And I mean, even during the Pharaonic times, Nubia was known for its archers, and they were sometimes nicknamed the eye smiters, for the ability to put out their opponent's eyes with the bow and arrow. So when the Arabs attempt to come and conquer Nubia, they're basically unsuccessful, and then they sign a treaty called the Bak Treaty. And this Bak Treaty is actually international diplomacy between Muslim Egypt and Christian Nubia, and it would persist up until the 13th century. And then Christianity would not erode in Nubia until finally the 14th to 15th century. So Christianity persists in Nubia and then, of course, the Sudan for nearly 1,000 years. Muslim Egypt during various periods, the Abbasid, Umayyads, even up until the Ottoman times, Nubia continues to be a Christian kingdom, if you will, able to stand on its own and conduct diplomacy with Muslim Egypt. Nubia was always a part of the Coptic Orthodox Church. In other words, the patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church is the one who basically commissioned bishops and priests in Nubia and appointed. They were ordained in Egypt, sometime in Alexandria, other times maybe in the environment of Upper Egypt. And this persisted for the entire time of the Nubian church. So the Nubian church, ecclesiastically, the Nubian church was connected to the patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church.
And this is all included in your book?
Yes.
Wow. Yes. So actually you cannot understand the entirety of Coptic Christianity without studying Nubian Christianity and Ethiopian Christianity in particular. These three locale of Christianity complement each other.
Yes, they're complemented, and their histories are intertwined, interrelated, and interdependent.
Yes, yes, definitely interdependent, because if I may ask you to tell us about the king of Nubia who came to the rescue of the Coptic patriarch who was imprisoned by the caliph.
Yes, yes.
In
the early 8th century.
Right.
Yes.
Would you please tell us this story?
Of course, this story.
Is it in the book?
Yes.
Okay.
I allude to that in the epilogue of my book.
Okay.
Although my book focuses primarily on the 4th to the 6th century.
Yes.
But I do allude to that historical period of when the king of Nubia in the early 8th century, Zacharias, travels to Cairo to defend the honor of Abba Michael in the 8th century, who has been imprisoned by one of the caliphs. This story is also mentioned in the histories of the Coptic Orthodox Church. Yes. This story is mentioned and talked about a great deal.
Right.
The Nubian church also being vital politically and militarily in terms of serving as a defense for the Coptic Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
Yes.
What a wonderful
under Islamic rule.
Yeah, what a wonderful story, not just this one, but the entire 1,000 years of Nubian Christianity to be explored more and more. And I look forward to more research and publications in this field. I want to tell you how honored I am and lucky to have met you about 10 years ago while you were doing your PhD at Claremont Graduate University. And after the PhD, of course, I was waiting with anticipation this fabulous volume. And I wanted to thank you for producing this volume and for accepting our invitation to be on Logos TV, my program Coptic Civilization. And thank you so much, Professor Salim Faraji, for your kindness and scholarship that you enlightened us today with.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, our dear viewers, for watching us. This is Coptic Civilization. I'm Michael Saad.